The carriage door slammed shut before Alina Whitmore could say a single word in her own defense. She sat frozen on the leather seat, her gloved hands pressed together in her lap, while the wheels began to turn beneath her. Through the small window, she watched her mother's face disappear behind the tall iron gates of the townhouse, and she understood with a cold and sudden clarity that she was truly being sent away. Just an hour earlier, she had been standing in the drawing room, listening to her father read a letter aloud in a voice that shook the walls. The letter had come from a family friend, warning that a rumor was spreading through London society, a rumor that could ruin the Whitmore name forever. Alina had tried to explain, tried to tell her side of the story, but no one in that room had wanted to hear it. Her mother had turned away. Her father had simply pointed toward the door. Now here she was, rushing away from everything she had ever known, toward a country house she had only heard about in passing conversations. A place called Thornfield Hollow, buried somewhere in the quiet hills far from the noise and shine of the city. Alina pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the carriage window and closed her eyes. She thought of the ballroom where she had danced only weeks before, the candles glowing gold against the walls, and the man who had held her hand a little longer than propriety allowed. Julian Hartwell, Duke of Ravenswood, had looked at her that night as though she were the only person in the entire room. She had believed, for one reckless moment, that her life was about to change for the better. Instead, it had changed in the worst way imaginable. She did not know if Julian had heard the rumors yet. She did not know if he believed them. All she knew was that she was being pulled farther away from him with every turn of the carriage wheels, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The journey took the better part of 2 days. Alina barely spoke during the long hours on the road. Her lady's maid, a warm and steady young woman named Bess Carter, sat across from her, offering quiet comfort whenever the silence grew too heavy. Bess had been given no real explanation for the sudden trip either, only instructions from Alina's mother to accompany her mistress and make sure she settled in properly. "You should try to rest, my lady," Bess said gently, as the carriage rattled over a rough patch of road. "It will not help to arrive looking as tired as you feel." Alina managed a small, tired smile. "I do not think there is anything that can help how I feel right now, Bess." Bess reached across and squeezed her hand. "Then let us just get through today. Tomorrow can worry about itself." It was the kind of practical comfort that Alina desperately needed, even if it could not erase the ache sitting heavy in her chest. When the carriage finally turned down a narrow lane lined with tall, bare trees, Alina lifted her head and looked out at the countryside for the first time since they had left London. The field stretched wide and green under a pale afternoon sky, broken only by low stone walls and the occasional grazing sheep. It was nothing like the crowded streets and towering buildings she was used to. It felt like another world entirely. Thornfield Hollow appeared at the end of the lane, a house built of gray stone with ivy climbing along one side and tall windows that reflected the fading light. It was smaller than the townhouse in London, and clearly less cared for, but there was something quietly beautiful about it, something that felt untouched by the harsh judgments of society. An older woman stood waiting at the front steps, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. She introduced herself as Mrs. Foley, the housekeeper who had looked after the estate for many years while the family rarely visited. Her expression was kind though curious as she studied Alina's tired face. "You must be worn out from the journey," Mrs. Foley said, guiding them inside. "I have prepared rooms for you both, and there is a hot meal waiting whenever you are ready." Alina thanked her quietly, though her mind was still miles away, back in London, wondering what was being said about her in the parlors and ballrooms she had once belonged to. That night, alone in an unfamiliar bedroom, Alina sat by the window and looked out at the dark countryside. There were no streetlights here, no distant sounds of carriages or laughter from nearby houses. Only silence and the soft rustle of wind moving through the trees. She thought about writing to Julian. The idea rose in her mind again and again, tempting and terrifying at once. What would she even say? That she had been sent away because of a scandal she had not caused, that her own family had chosen to believe the worst of her rather than defend her name. She did not know if he would believe her, or if he even wanted to hear from her at all. In the end, she decided against it. If Julian truly cared for her, she told herself, he would find a way to learn the truth on his own. And if he did not, then perhaps it was better this way. Better to disappear quietly than to beg for an explanation that might never come. Over the next few days, Alina tried to settle into the strange rhythm of country life. She walked the fields in the early mornings, watched the sun rise over the hills, and slowly began to notice small details she had never paid attention to in the city. The way frost clung to the grass at dawn, the sound of birds calling from the hedgerows, the simple, steady pace of a life lived far from ballrooms and gossip. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was, she realized, the first time in a long while that she had been able to breathe without feeling the constant pressure of other people's expectations pressing down on her. Still, beneath the calm surface of her new days, a quiet ache remained. She missed her sister, Charlotte, who had not even been allowed to say goodbye properly. She missed the warmth of familiar rooms, even if those rooms had ultimately turned against her. And most of all, she missed the feeling of being seen, truly seen, the way Julian had looked at her that last night in the ballroom. One afternoon, while walking along the edge of the property, Alina came across a small cottage where a farmer named Tom lived with his young daughter, Alice. The girl was chasing a stubborn goat through the yard, laughing loudly despite her clear frustration. Alina found herself smiling for the first time in days. "That goat has a mind of his own," Tom called out, wiping his hands on his trousers as he approached the fence. "You must be the lady staying up at the Hollow." "I am," Alina replied, "Alina Whitmore." "Well, Miss Whitmore, welcome to our little corner of nowhere," Tom said with a friendly grin. "It is quiet here, but it has its own kind of charm once you get used to it." Alina glanced toward Alice, who had finally managed to catch the goat and was now hugging it despite its obvious annoyance. "I think I am beginning to see that." It was a small moment, simple and unremarkable in most ways, but it planted a seed of something Alina had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the grand, sweeping hope of rescue or redemption, but a quieter kind, the hope that even in exile, she might still find pieces of herself worth holding on to. As the days passed, Alina slowly began to write letters, though not the one she truly wanted to send. She wrote to Charlotte, hoping the letters would somehow reach her sister despite their parents' watchful eyes. She wrote small, careful notes describing the countryside, the strange comfort of the quiet, and her attempts to adjust to a life so different from anything she had known. She did not write about her feelings for Julian. She did not write about the ache that returned every night when the house grew silent and her thoughts drifted back to London. Some pains, she decided, were meant to be carried alone. But even as she told herself this, a small, stubborn part of her heart refused to let go of the memory of his hand in hers, the warmth in his eyes, the way he had spoken her name as though it meant something important. Late one evening, as she sat by the fire in the small study Mrs. Foley had shown her, Alina found an old writing desk tucked into the corner of the room. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, clearly untouched for years. She ran her fingers across the smooth wood and, almost without thinking, opened one of the drawers. Inside was a stack of blank parchment, a bottle of ink long since dried out, and a single quill resting quietly, waiting to be used again. Alina stared at it for a long moment. She was not ready to write to Julian yet. She was not ready to face whatever answer or silence might come in return. But something about that empty parchment felt like a quiet invitation, a reminder that even here, far from everything she had lost, she still had a voice. She closed the drawer gently and rose from her chair, telling herself that the letter, if it ever came, would come when she was ready and not a moment before. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees surrounding Thornfield Hollow, carrying with it the distant, uncertain promise of everything that was still to come. Alina did not know, as she climbed the stairs to bed that night, how much her quiet exile would eventually change the course of her life. She did not know that hundreds of miles away, in a townhouse far grander than the one she had left behind, a man was already beginning to notice her absence, and beginning to ask questions no one seemed willing to answer. For now all she knew was the soft creak of old floorboards beneath her feet, and the strange, unfamiliar comfort of a house that asked nothing of her except to simply exist within its walls. And for the first time since leaving London, Elinor allowed herself a single, cautious thought. Perhaps this was not the end of her story. Perhaps it was only the beginning. 3 weeks into her stay at Thornfield Hollow, Elinor woke to the sound of rain hammering against her window, and for a moment, lying still beneath the heavy quilt, she almost forgot where she was. Then the memory returned, as it always did, quiet and unwelcome. London, the scandal, the carriage ride that had ended everything she once knew. She rose slowly, dressed without much thought, and made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Foley already busy in the kitchen, humming softly to herself while she prepared breakfast. The housekeeper had become, in a short time, one of the few steady comforts in Elinor's new life, along with Bess, who never once complained about their sudden change in circumstances. "There is a letter for you, my lady," Mrs. Foley said, nodding toward the small entry table near the door. "Came early this morning with the post rider." Elinor's heart jumped, foolishly, hopefully, before she reminded herself that it was far too soon to expect anything from London, let alone from Julian. She walked over and picked up the envelope, recognizing her sister Charlotte's careful handwriting immediately. She carried the letter to the window seat in the small sitting room and opened it with trembling fingers. Charlotte's words were careful, clearly written with the knowledge that their parents might read the letter before it was ever sent. She spoke mostly of ordinary things, the weather in London, a new hat she had purchased, a dinner party she had recently attended. But tucked near the end, almost hidden between innocent sentences, was a single line that made Elinor's breath catch. "The Duke has been asking after you. He does not believe what everyone else believes." Elinor read the sentence 3 times before setting the letter down in her lap. Her hands were shaking, though whether from hope or fear she could not quite tell. Julian did not believe the rumors. Someone somewhere had told him something, and he had chosen not to accept the story that had been used to justify sending her away. It should have brought her comfort. Instead, it brought a fresh wave of longing so strong it nearly took her breath away. If Julian did not believe the lies, then perhaps there was still a version of her life where she was not simply forgotten, where the truth still mattered to someone. But what good was that truth if she remained hidden away in the countryside, unable to speak for herself? For the rest of the morning, Elinor found herself unable to settle into any of her usual routines. She wandered from room to room, picked up a book only to set it down again minutes later, and eventually found herself standing once more in front of the old writing desk in the study. She opened the drawer and stared at the blank parchment inside. Not yet, she told herself, closing the drawer again. Not yet. Instead, she pulled on her cloak and stepped outside despite the light rain still falling, needing the fresh air to clear her thoughts. She walked toward the tenant cottages at the edge of the property, hoping the familiar sight of Tom and Alice might offer some small distraction from the storm building inside her chest. She found Alice sitting beneath the small covered porch of their cottage, carefully mending a torn piece of cloth with clumsy, determined stitches. "You are getting quite good at that," Elinor said, stepping up beside her. Alice looked up and grinned. "Papa says I will never be a proper seamstress, but I do not mind. It keeps my hands busy." Elinor sat down beside her on the wooden bench, grateful for the girl's easy company. "Sometimes keeping busy is exactly what we need." Alice studied her for a moment, tilting her head slightly. "You look sad today, Miss Whitmore." Elinor let out a soft, surprised laugh at the girl's directness. "Do I?" "A little," Alice admitted. "Papa says people from the city always look a bit sad when they first come here. He says the quiet takes some getting used to." "Perhaps he is right," Elinor said softly, though she suspected her sadness had little to do with the quiet of the countryside, and everything to do with the noise she had left behind. They sat together for a while, watching the rain fall gently over the fields, until Tom returned from tending the animals and invited Alina inside for a cup of tea. She accepted gladly, grateful for the warmth and the simple, undemanding company. As the days continued to pass, Alina found herself growing more comfortable at Thornfield Hollow, even as the ache for her old life refused to fully disappear. She began helping Mrs. Foley with small tasks around the house, tending the modest garden behind the kitchen, and taking long walks through the fields whenever the weather allowed. She also began, slowly and carefully, to write. Not letters meant to be sent at first, but private pages meant only for herself. She wrote about the unfairness of what had happened, about the anger she still carried toward her parents for believing rumors over her own word. She wrote about her fear that Julian might eventually give up searching for the truth, worn down by the pressures of his own family and society. And though she resisted it for a long time, she eventually began to write about him directly. About the warmth of his laughter, the steady way he had once looked at her, as though she were someone worth protecting rather than someone to be quietly discarded. One evening, after finishing one such page, Alina sat back in her chair and stared at the words she had written. She realized, with a strange mixture of fear and clarity, that she was no longer simply processing her feelings. She was building the letter she had been too afraid to write. Meanwhile, though Alina had no way of knowing it, similar unrest was stirring within the walls of a grand London townhouse belonging to the Hartwell family. Julian, Duke of Ravenswood, had spent the weeks since Alina's sudden disappearance growing increasingly frustrated with the vague and inconsistent explanations offered by her family. Whenever he asked after her, he received only careful, rehearsed answers about her health, her need for rest, her sudden preference for country living. None of it matched the woman he had come to know, a woman who had always spoken of London's energy with genuine affection. Something was being hidden from him, and he intended to find out exactly what it was. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had made her own opinions clear on multiple occasions. She believed the timing of Alina's departure, so soon after certain unpleasant rumors began circulating, was far too convenient to be dismissed as coincidence. "You must let this go, Julian," she told him one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room after supper. "Whatever occurred, it is clearly a private family matter. It is not your place to interfere." "She is the woman I intended to marry, Mother," Julian said firmly. "That makes it very much my place." The Dowager Duchess sighed, setting down her teacup with a soft clink against its saucer. "Intended is a dangerous word, Julian. You never made any formal declaration. If you pursue this further, and the rumors prove true, you risk damaging your own reputation for a woman who may not even wish to be found." Julian's jaw tightened at her words, though he said nothing in response. He knew his mother believed she was protecting him, but her caution only strengthened his growing certainty that something important had been buried beneath layers of careful, convenient silence. He began making quiet inquiries among his closest connections, avoiding anyone directly tied to the Whitmore family, trusting instead in servants and acquaintances who owed him small favors from the past. Slowly, fragments of information began to surface, though nothing yet formed a complete picture. One evening, a longtime friend of the family mentioned, almost in passing, that the rumor which had caused such an uproar had originated from a source with a personal grudge against Alina, rather than from any genuine misconduct on her part. Julian's suspicion sharpened into something closer to certainty. He remembered a conversation from weeks earlier, before Alina's sudden departure, involving a man named Colonel Grant, a wealthy and ambitious suitor whom Alina's parents had once hoped she might marry. Alina had firmly, and publicly, refused his attentions on more than one occasion, embarrassing him in front of several important social circles. It was not difficult, once Julian considered the timing carefully, to imagine that a wounded pride might have led to whispered lies designed to damage Alina's reputation beyond repair. Still, suspicion alone was not proof, and Julian understood that confronting the Whitmore family without solid evidence would accomplish nothing beyond making himself appear reckless and unreasonable in the eyes of society. He needed something more concrete. He needed the truth, spoken plainly, from someone who had no reason to lie. He needed to hear it from Alina herself. But with her hidden away at an estate he did not even know the exact location of, and with her family clearly determined to keep them apart, Julian found himself trapped in a frustrating position, caught between his growing certainty and his complete lack of any real way to act on it. Back at Thornfield Hollow, unaware of the quiet storm building on Julian's side of the story, Alina continued her private pages late into the evenings, slowly filling them with everything she had once been too afraid to say aloud. One night, after a particularly long and difficult day spent thinking of home, Alina finally allowed herself to write the words she had avoided for weeks. If you ever read this, Julian, I want you to know the truth, exactly as it happened, without any softening or excuse. She stopped there, staring at the sentence for a long moment before setting down her quill. It was only the beginning of a single line. But it was a beginning nonetheless, and somewhere deep inside her, Alina understood that she had finally crossed a threshold she could not easily retreat from. The letter, whatever shape it eventually took, was coming. She simply did not yet know when she would find the courage to send it, or whether it would ever reach the man it was meant for. Outside her window, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a clear, star-filled sky stretching endlessly over the quiet countryside, indifferent to the quiet battle being fought within the walls of Thornfield Hollow. Alina closed her notebook, blew out the candle beside her bed, and lay awake for a long while, listening to the silence and wondering, not for the first time, whether some truths were worth the risk of speaking aloud. A month had now passed since Alina first arrived at Thornfield Hollow, and the countryside had begun to change with the season, the fields turning golden as the last warmth of autumn settled over the hills. Alina had grown steadier in her new life, though the quiet ache for what she had lost never fully disappeared. She had come to know the rhythms of the estate well, the early morning mist that clung to the grass, the sound of Mrs. Foley moving about the kitchen before sunrise, the distant calls of Tom's animals from across the fields. Yet nothing had changed the way her heart tightened whenever a letter arrived from London. Charlotte's letters continued to come every few weeks, each one carefully worded to avoid drawing suspicion from their parents. Alina had learned to read between the careful lines, searching for any small mention of Julian, any hint of what was happening in the world she had been forced to leave behind. One afternoon, while sitting in the garden behind the house, Alina unfolded a new letter from Charlotte and felt her breath catch as she read the opening lines. Mother and father are furious. The Duke has been asking questions all over town, questions no one seems willing to answer honestly. Colonel Grant has grown strangely nervous whenever the subject comes up. I do not know what it means, but I thought you should know. Alina read the passage 3 times, her mind racing through the implications. If Julian was asking questions, if he was pressing hard enough to make Colonel Grant nervous, then perhaps he already suspected the truth behind her sudden exile. The realization filled her with a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope, because it meant Julian had not simply accepted the story he had been given. Fear, because if he pushed too hard without proof, he might damage his own standing for a truth he could not yet confirm. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, staring out at the golden fields stretching before her. It was time. She could no longer sit quietly in the countryside, hoping that fragments of truth might somehow reach Julian on their own. If he was already searching for answers, then she owed him the full and honest truth, delivered directly from her own hand. That evening, after Bess had helped her prepare for bed and the house had settled into its usual quiet stillness, Alina lit a single candle in the study and sat down at the old writing desk. She opened the drawer, removed a fresh sheet of parchment, and dipped her quill into a newly purchased bottle of ink. For a long moment, she simply stared at the blank page. Then slowly, the words began to come. She wrote about the night of the ball, the warmth she had felt standing beside him, the quiet promise she had believed was beginning to form between them. She wrote about the sudden accusation that had reached her family, a claim that she had behaved improperly with a man she had never even shown interest in, a claim built entirely on the bitter resentment of a suitor she had firmly refused. She wrote about her parents' unwillingness to hear her side of the story, their fear of scandal outweighing their trust in their own daughter. She wrote about the carriage ride to Thornfield Hollow, the silence that had followed her ever since, and the quiet, aching loneliness of being cut off from everyone she had once known. And finally, with trembling hands, she wrote the words she had been most afraid to admit. I do not write this letter hoping you will come for me, Julian. I do not believe that is something either of us can afford, given everything that has happened. I write only because I could not bear the thought of you believing lies about my character, when the truth, however painful, deserves to be known. Whatever happens next, whatever choices you make, I want you to know that my feelings toward you were always honest, and they remain so still. She signed her name at the bottom, folded the letter carefully, and sealed it before she could allow herself the chance to reconsider. The next morning, Alina asked Mrs. Foley if there was a way to send a private letter without it passing through the usual channels connected to her family. Mrs. Foley, sensing the seriousness in Alina's tone, arranged for a trusted local writer to carry the letter directly to a coaching inn on the main road to London, where it could be sent onward without drawing attention from anyone tied to the Whitmore household. Alina watched the rider disappear down the lane with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. She had done it. The truth was finally on its way to Julian, regardless of what came next. For the following days, Alina found herself unable to fully settle into her usual routines. She often caught herself staring toward the lane, half expecting some sign or signal that the letter had reached its destination, though she knew such hopes were unreasonable given the distance and time involved. Bess noticed the change in her mistress almost immediately. You seem different today, my lady, she said one morning as she helped Alina arrange her hair. Lighter somehow, though also more nervous. Alina met her own eyes in the small mirror on the dressing table. I have finally told him the truth, Bess. Whatever happens now, at least I have done that much. Bess smiled softly, resting a gentle hand on Alina's shoulder. Then you have already done something very brave, my lady, regardless of how he responds. Meanwhile in London, Julian's search for answers had reached a frustrating standstill. Despite his careful inquiries, no one seemed willing to provide the concrete proof he needed to confront the Whitmore family directly. Colonel Grant continued to avoid him at social gatherings, offering only polite, meaningless conversation whenever their paths crossed. The Dowager Duchess, growing weary of her son's continued preoccupation with the matter, had begun quietly arranging introductions to several eligible young women from respectable families, hoping to redirect his attention toward a more suitable and less complicated match. Julian endured these introductions with polite patience, though his thoughts remained firmly fixed on Alina, wherever she might currently be. He had come to accept that without new information, his search would likely remain stalled indefinitely, a frustrating reality he found increasingly difficult to bear. It was during this period of uncertainty that a young servant named Henry Doyle, employed within the Hartwell household, approached Julian with a quiet and unexpected piece of information. Henry had a distant cousin who worked as a stable hand for a coaching inn along the main road, leading toward the northern countryside. During a recent visit, his cousin had mentioned, almost in passing, a private letter recently sent onward from a young lady named Whitmore, addressed directly to the Duke of Ravenswood. Henry, aware of his employer's ongoing concern regarding Alina's disappearance, had quietly arranged to have the letter intercepted before it could be lost among the countless pieces of ordinary correspondence passing through the inn each week. He now stood before Julian in the quiet privacy of the study, holding the sealed letter carefully in both hands. Your Grace, Henry said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, I believe this belongs to you. Julian rose slowly from his chair, his eyes fixed on the familiar handwriting across the front of the envelope. He recognized it immediately, having seen Aliner's careful, elegant script many times before on invitations and personal notes exchanged during happier days. "Where did you find this?" Julian asked, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. Henry explained the situation carefully, describing his cousin's role at the coaching inn, and the fortunate timing that had allowed the letter to reach Julian's hands rather than disappearing into the ordinary flow of correspondence. Julian thanked him sincerely, promising to remember his loyalty, before dismissing him quietly and turning his full attention to the letter now resting in his hands. He broke the seal carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the pages within. As he began to read, the study around him seemed to fade entirely from his awareness, replaced instead by Aliner's voice, clear and honest, finally explaining everything that had happened since that fateful night at the ball. With each line, Julian's expression shifted from cautious hope to growing disbelief, and finally to a deep, burning anger directed not at Aliner, but at the people who had so carelessly discarded her based on nothing more than bitter, unfounded rumors. When he reached the final lines, the quiet admission of her continued feelings despite everything she had endured, Julian felt something inside his chest tighten painfully, followed almost immediately by a fierce, unshakable resolve. He read the letter a second time, then a third, committing every word to memory as though doing so might somehow bring her closer, despite the many miles separating them. Finally, he set the pages down on his desk and stood in silence for a long moment, staring out the window toward the darkening London sky. He no longer needed further proof. He no longer needed careful, cautious inquiries or quiet conversations with hesitant acquaintances. He had the truth, delivered directly from the one person whose word mattered most to him. Aliner Whitmore had been wronged, cast aside by her own family based on a lie designed to protect a wounded man's pride, and left to endure that injustice entirely alone in the quiet countryside. Julian turned from the window, his expression set with a quiet, determined fire that had not been present in his features for many weeks. Whatever it cost him, whatever obstacles his family or society might place in his path, he intended to make things right. He rang for Henry immediately, his voice steady and clear as he issued a single, decisive command. "Prepare my horse," Julian said. "I leave within the hour." The Dowager Duchess found her son in the middle of the front hall, already dressed in traveling clothes, giving rapid instructions to a pair of startled servants. "Julian, what on earth is happening?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern as she descended the last few steps of the staircase. "You cannot simply announce that you are leaving without any explanation." Julian turned to face his mother, his expression calm but unmistakably resolute. "I have received a letter from Aliner Whitmore. I now know exactly what happened to her, and I intend to go to her immediately." The Dowager Duchess's face paled slightly, though she recovered quickly, folding her hands in front of her with practiced composure. "You cannot be serious. Riding off to some remote estate over a letter, without any thought to how this will appear to society, is reckless in the extreme." "I have thought of little else these past weeks, Mother," Julian replied. "And I am done waiting for permission to act on what I know to be true." "And what exactly do you believe to be true?" she asked, her voice tightening. Julian retrieved the letter from the inside pocket of his coat and handed it to her without hesitation. "Read it yourself. Then tell me you still believe I should simply let this matter rest." The Dowager Duchess accepted the letter with visible reluctance, her eyes moving quickly across the familiar handwriting as she read through Aliner's careful, honest account. Julian watched her expression shift slowly from skepticism to quiet, unmistakable concern. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him, her earlier sharpness noticeably softened. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then the Whitmore family has committed a grave injustice against that young woman." "It is true," Julian said firmly. "I have no doubt of it." The Dowager Duchess studied her son for a long moment, clearly weighing her own concerns against the seriousness of what she had just read. Finally, she let out a slow breath and nodded once, a gesture of reluctant acceptance rather than full approval. "Then go," she said quietly. "But understand, Julian, that once you take this step, there will be no quiet way to undo it. Society will talk, regardless of the truth behind it." "Let them talk," Julian replied, tucking the letter safely back into his coat. "I would rather face their gossip with a clear conscience than remain silent, while an innocent woman suffers for a lie." With that, he turned and strode out through the front doors, where Henry Doyle stood waiting beside a saddled horse, already prepared for the long journey ahead. The roads leading out of London were crowded with the usual afternoon traffic, carriages and carts moving slowly through the busy streets. Julian pressed forward with careful patience, knowing that any reckless haste within the city would only slow him down further. Once he cleared the outer edges of London, however, the roads opened wide before him, stretching toward the northern countryside where Thornfield Hollow waited, still hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. He rode hard through the remaining hours of daylight, stopping only briefly to rest his horse and take a quick meal at a small roadside inn. The innkeeper, noticing his obvious urgency, offered a fresh horse for the next stretch of the journey, an offer Julian gratefully accepted despite the additional cost. As night fell, Julian continued onward beneath a sky scattered with stars, guided only by the pale light of a rising moon and his own unwavering determination. His thoughts remained fixed entirely on Alina, replaying every line of her letter over and over in his mind. He thought of the confidence she had once shown at social gatherings, the quiet strength beneath her graceful manners, and the warmth in her eyes whenever their conversations had drifted toward subjects deeper than fashionable small talk. He remembered, too, the night of the ball, the way she had laughed softly at something he had said, unaware that it would be one of the last carefree moments they would share before everything changed. The thought of her enduring weeks of isolation and quiet suffering, entirely because of a lie born from wounded pride, filled him with a renewed sense of urgency that pushed aside any consideration of exhaustion or discomfort. By the time the first light of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Julian had covered a significant portion of the journey, though a considerable distance still remained. He allowed himself a short rest at another roadside inn, eating quickly and resting his horse before continuing onward without delay. The countryside around him gradually shifted as the day progressed, the busy roads giving way to quieter lanes lined with hedgerows and open fields. Julian found himself grateful for the solitude, using the long hours of riding to steady his thoughts and prepare himself for whatever conversation awaited him once he finally reached Thornfield Hollow. He did not know exactly how Alina would react to his sudden arrival. Her letter had made clear that she did not expect, or perhaps even want, him to come rushing to her defense. But Julian understood with quiet certainty that he could not simply send a reply from a distance and consider his obligation fulfilled. Some truths, he believed, deserved to be spoken directly, face to face, without the careful distance of written words standing between them. As the second day of his journey stretched onward, Julian's determination remained unshaken despite the growing fatigue settling into his body. He pushed through the discomfort, driven by the memory of Alina's words and the injustice she had so quietly endured. By late afternoon, Henry Doyle, who had insisted on accompanying his employer for at least part of the journey, suggested they stop for a proper rest before continuing further. "You will do her no good, Your Grace, if you arrive too exhausted to think clearly," Henry pointed out, watching Julian carefully as they slowed their horses along a quiet stretch of road. Julian reluctantly agreed, recognizing the wisdom in Henry's words despite his own impatience to continue. They found lodging at a modest inn along the road, where Julian managed a few hours of restless sleep before rising again well before dawn, eager to resume the journey. The final stretch of road leading toward the northern countryside proved more difficult than the earlier portions of the journey, the smooth main roads giving way to narrower, less maintained paths winding through increasingly remote farmland. Julian pressed forward regardless, guided by directions gathered from local innkeepers and travelers familiar with the region surrounding Thornfield Hollow. As the third day of travel began, Julian felt a mixture of exhaustion and mounting anticipation building within him. He was close now, close enough that each passing mile felt heavier with meaning than the last. He thought again of Eleanor's letter, particularly the quiet, painful honesty of her closing words, her admission that she did not expect him to come, yet her unwillingness to let him continue believing false rumors about her character. It was, Julian realized, one of the bravest things he had ever read, a woman choosing honesty over self-protection, even while fully expecting nothing in return. He intended to prove her wrong about that expectation, regardless of the cost to his own reputation or his family's careful social standing. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Julian spotted a small signpost along the road indicating the direction toward Thornfield Hollow, still several miles distant but finally, unmistakably within reach. His heart quickened at the sight, exhaustion momentarily forgotten, as he urged his tired horse onward with renewed energy. He was close now. After weeks of uncertainty, careful inquiries, and quiet, frustrated searching, he was finally close enough to make things right. 3 days after sending her letter, Eleanor received a message that filled her with more alarm than any of Charlotte's carefully worded updates ever had. It arrived not through the usual post rider, but through a private courier hired directly by her father, a fact that immediately told Eleanor something serious had happened. She broke the seal quickly, her eyes scanning the short, sharply worded note. "It has come to our attention that you have been in contact with the Duke of Ravenswood. This behavior is unacceptable and threatens the fragile peace we have worked hard to maintain regarding this unfortunate matter. You will cease all correspondence immediately. Arrangements are being made to relocate you to a more distant property until this situation has fully settled." Eleanor read the note twice, her hands trembling slightly by the time she finished. Somehow, her father had learned of the letter she had sent to Julian, though she could not begin to guess how such information had reached him so quickly. More alarming still was the mention of relocation. If her family intended to move her further away, to somewhere even more remote and difficult to reach, it would make any hope of resolving the situation directly with Julian nearly impossible. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, the note resting in her lap, before rising quickly and hurrying to find Bess. "We may not have much time," Eleanor said, explaining the contents of the letter as calmly as she could manage despite the panic building steadily in her chest. "If my father intends to move me again, I fear it will be somewhere designed specifically to keep me isolated." Bess's expression tightened with concern. "Do you believe the Duke received your letter, my lady?" "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. "But if my father has already discovered that I sent it, then perhaps someone intercepted it before it ever reached him." The thought filled her with fresh dread. If the letter had been intercepted by someone loyal to her family, rather than reaching Julian directly, then her honesty had accomplished nothing beyond alerting her parents to her continued defiance, likely making her situation considerably worse. Over the following 2 days, Eleanor found herself caught in a state of restless uncertainty, uncertain whether to prepare for a sudden, unwanted relocation, or to hold onto the fragile hope that her letter had somehow reached its intended destination, despite her family's apparent knowledge of it. Mrs. Foley, sensing the tension gripping the household, quietly offered her own careful observations. "There has been a rider passing through the village more than once these past few days," she mentioned one evening, as she helped prepare a simple supper, asking questions about the roads leading toward London and whether anyone had seen unfamiliar travelers passing through recently. Eleanor's heart quickened at this information. "Do you know who sent this rider, Mrs. Foley?" "I could not say for certain, my lady," Mrs. Foley admitted, "but it seemed a strange thing to ask unless someone was expecting a visitor from that direction." Eleanor turned the information over carefully in her mind. unsure whether to interpret it as a hopeful sign or simply further evidence of her family's growing suspicion and control. She wanted desperately to believe that the writer's questions meant Julian was somehow already on his way, but she forced herself to remain cautious, unwilling to build false hope upon such uncertain information. That night, unable to sleep, Alina found herself once again seated at the old writing desk, staring at a fresh sheet of parchment. If her family truly intended to relocate her before any resolution could be reached, she needed a plan of her own, some way to protect herself from being pulled even further from any possibility of the truth being properly acknowledged. She began drafting a second letter, this one addressed directly to Charlotte, explaining the threat of relocation and asking her sister to discover, as discreetly as possible, exactly what their father intended and when such a move might take place. She had barely finished the letter when a sudden, unexpected sound reached her from outside, the distinct rhythm of hooves approaching rapidly along the quiet country lane. Alina rose immediately, her heart pounding as she moved quickly to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside into the darkness. A single rider was approaching the house, moving with obvious urgency despite the late hour. Alina could not make out any clear details in the darkness, but something about the rider's posture, the confident, determined way he sat upon his horse, sent a sudden, unexpected wave of recognition through her chest. She told herself it was foolish to hope, that the rider was far more likely to be another messenger from her father than the man she had spent weeks quietly longing for. Still, she found herself moving quickly toward the stairs, her heart racing as she made her way down toward the front hall, where Mrs. Foley had already appeared, roused by the sound of approaching hooves. "Someone is coming, my lady," Mrs. Foley said, her voice tight with cautious alertness. "At this hour it can hardly be good news." Alina said nothing, her attention fixed entirely on the front door as the sound of hooves grew steadily louder, finally coming to a stop just outside the house. A long moment passed in tense silence before a firm knock echoed through the quiet hall. Mrs. Foley moved cautiously toward the door, glancing back briefly at Alina before lifting the heavy latch and pulling it open. Standing in the doorway, travel-worn and exhausted but unmistakable despite the dim light of a single lantern, was a messenger Alina did not recognize, holding a sealed letter bearing the unmistakable crest of the Hartwell family. Alina's breath caught sharply in her chest. "A letter for Miss Alina Whitmore," the messenger said, his voice hoarse from what had clearly been a long and difficult journey. "From His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood." Alina stepped forward, her hands trembling as she accepted the sealed letter from the messenger's outstretched hand. She thanked him quietly, her voice barely steady, while Mrs. Foley quickly arranged for the exhausted rider to be given food and a place to rest before continuing his return journey. Alina carried the letter into the small sitting room, her fingers fumbling slightly as she broke the familiar seal and unfolded the pages within. Julian's handwriting, bold and steady despite what she assumed had been considerable haste, filled the page before her. "Alina, I have received your letter, and I want you to know, without any doubt, that I believe every word you have written. The truth you have shared has only strengthened my resolve, rather than diminishing it in any way. I do not intend to remain in London while you continue to suffer the consequences of a lie designed to protect a wounded man's pride. I am writing this letter from the road, having already begun my journey toward Thornfield Hollow. By the time this reaches you, I expect to be no more than a day or two behind it. I understand you did not write to me expecting rescue, and I respect that choice completely. But I could not, in good conscience, remain silent while believing you to be enduring this injustice alone. Whatever comes next, whatever difficulties we may face in convincing others of the truth, I want you to know that I intend to stand beside you through all of it, if you will allow me to. Yours always, Julian." Alina read the letter twice through tears she had not realized were falling until they blurred the careful, familiar handwriting before her. He had received it, he believed her, and he was already on his way. The relief flooding through her chest was almost immediately followed by a fresh wave of anxious urgency. If Julian was truly only a day or two behind this messenger, then her family's threat of relocation posed an even greater danger than before. If they succeeded in moving her before he arrived, there was no telling how difficult it might become for him to find her again. She hurried to find Bess, explaining the contents of the letter as quickly as her racing thoughts would allow. "We must be ready," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions still coursing through her. "If my father's arrangements for relocation arrive before the Duke does, I do not know what we will be forced to do." Bess nodded firmly, already moving to gather a few essential belongings, preparing for whatever might come next. Mrs. Foley, upon learning the full situation, offered her own quiet reassurance. "I will keep watch along the lane, my lady, and send word immediately should any unfamiliar carriage approach before your Duke arrives." Elinor thanked her sincerely, grateful beyond words for the quiet loyalty she had found among the small household staff during her time at Thornfield Hollow. That night, despite her exhaustion, sleep remained impossible. Elinor sat by her window long after the house had fallen silent, watching the dark countryside stretching endlessly beyond the glass, wondering how much longer she would need to wait before either danger or rescue finally arrived at her door. She thought of Julian somewhere on the road, pushing through exhaustion and difficult terrain, driven by nothing more than the truth she had trusted him enough to share. The thought filled her with a warmth she had not felt in weeks, a warmth strong enough to push back, at least temporarily, the fear of what her family might still attempt before he arrived. Whatever happened next, Elinor understood that her quiet exile was rapidly approaching its end, one way or another. The only remaining question was which force would reach Thornfield Hollow first, the truth riding steadily toward her, or the fear determined to keep her hidden away forever. The following morning arrived gray and heavy with mist, the kind of quiet, still weather that seemed to hold its breath along with the household inside Thornfield Hollow. Elinor rose early, having managed only a few scattered hours of restless sleep, and found Mrs. Foley already standing near the front window of the sitting room, watching the lane with careful attention. "No sign of anyone yet, my lady," the housekeeper said without turning from her post, "though the morning is still young." Elinor nodded, joining her briefly at the window before forcing herself to move away, unwilling to spend the entire day standing anxiously in place. She busied herself instead with small tasks around the house, though her attention remained fixed, at every moment, on the sound of approaching wheels or hooves along the quiet country road. By mid-morning, Bess had finished quietly packing a small bag of essential belongings, just in case Elinor found herself forced to leave suddenly, whether by her family's arrangement or by some safer alternative Julian might offer upon his arrival. "I do not wish to think the worst," Bess said, setting the bag near the door, "but it seems wise to be prepared whichever way this day unfolds." Elinor agreed, grateful once again for Bess's steady, practical presence throughout the entire ordeal. Just after noon, the quiet stillness of the household was broken by the distant sound of carriage wheels approaching along the lane. Elinor's heart lurched sharply in her chest as she hurried toward the window, her breath catching as she caught sight of the approaching vehicle. It was not Julian. The carriage bore the unmistakable crest of the Whitmore family, and Elinor recognized with a sinking feeling the stern, familiar figure of her father's personal secretary seated beside the driver. "They have come for me," Elinor said quietly, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and frustration, just as the letter warned. Mrs. Foley moved quickly to her side. "What would you have us do, my lady?" Elinor forced herself to think clearly despite the panic rising steadily in her chest. She could not simply refuse to leave without risking serious consequences, both for herself and potentially for the loyal household staff who had shown her nothing but kindness during her exile. Yet she also could not bear the thought of being moved further away, just as Julian was finally drawing close enough to reach her. "I will speak with them," Elinor decided finally, Perhaps I can delay matters at least long enough to buy a little more time. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands and made her way toward the front door, arriving just as the secretary, a thin, sharp-featured man named Mr. Colton, stepped down from the carriage with a stack of papers tucked carefully beneath his arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, offering a stiff, formal bow, "your father has instructed me to escort you immediately to a new residence, arrangements for which have already been finalized." "And where exactly is this new residence, Mr. Colton?" Alina asked, keeping her voice as steady and composed as she could manage. "That information is not mine to share," Mr. Colton replied evenly. "Your father's instructions were quite clear on that matter." Alina felt a fresh wave of frustration building within her, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "I see. And what if I am not yet prepared to leave today?" Mr. Colton's expression remained politely unmoved. "I am afraid your preparation is not a matter of choice, Miss Whitmore. Your father has been quite firm regarding the timing of this arrangement." Alina glanced briefly toward Mrs. Foley, who stood watching the exchange with quiet concern from the doorway, before turning her attention back to the secretary standing before her. "Might I at least be permitted a short time to gather my belongings properly?" Alina asked, forcing a note of calm reasonableness into her voice despite the urgency pressing heavily against her thoughts. "Surely my father would not wish me to arrive at this new residence in complete disarray." Mr. Colton hesitated briefly, clearly weighing the request against his instructions. "You may have 1 hour, Miss Whitmore." "No longer." Alina thanked him with careful politeness, though inwardly her mind raced through every possible way to stretch that single hour into something far longer. She returned inside quickly, finding Bess waiting anxiously near the stairs. "1 hour," Alina said quietly. "That is all the time we have been given." Bess's expression tightened with worry. "That is hardly any time at all, my lady." "I know," Alina admitted, "but it is all we have, so we must make the best possible use of it." Together, they moved through the house with deliberate slowness, gathering belongings with far more careful attention than the situation truly required, hoping to stretch the allotted hour as far as circumstances would allow. Meanwhile, outside, Mrs. Foley engaged Mr. Colton in a series of polite but persistent conversations, offering refreshments, discussing the condition of the roads, and raising small, seemingly innocent questions designed to consume as much of his attention, and as much time, as possible. Despite their combined efforts, however, the minutes continued to tick steadily forward, each one bringing Alina closer to a departure she desperately hoped to avoid. As the hour drew close to its end, Alina stood once more near the window of her bedroom, staring anxiously down the empty lane, silently willing Julian's arrival with every fiber of her being. The lane remained stubbornly empty. A soft knock sounded at her door moments later, followed by Mrs. Foley's careful voice. "My lady, Mr. Colton grows increasingly impatient. I do not believe I can delay him much further." Alina closed her eyes briefly, forcing down the rising panic threatening to overwhelm her composure. "Tell him I will be down shortly." She turned back toward the window one final time before leaving the room, and it was in that single, final glance that she caught sight of something in the distance, a small, moving shape approaching rapidly along the far end of the lane, kicking up a faint trail of dust behind it. Her heart leapt sharply in her chest. A rider, moving with unmistakable urgency, was approaching Thornfield Hollow at considerable speed. Alina pressed closer to the window, straining to make out any further details as the rider drew nearer, though the distance remained too great to identify him with any certainty. Still, something deep within her recognized the confident, determined posture of the approaching figure, and hope, sudden and overwhelming, surged through her chest with startling force. "Bess," Alina called out, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Come quickly." Bess hurried to her side, following her gaze toward the approaching rider now visible along the lane. "Do you believe it is him, my lady?" Bess asked softly. "I do not know," Alina admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she continued watching the rider's steady approach. "But I intend to find out before that carriage takes me anywhere." She turned quickly and hurried from the room, moving rapidly down the stairs toward the front hall, where Mr. Colton stood waiting with clear and growing impatience beside the open carriage door. "Miss Whitmore, the hour has passed," he said firmly. "We must depart immediately." Elinor stepped past him without hesitation, moving instead toward the edge of the property where the lane curved gently before reaching the house, her eyes fixed intently on the rapidly approaching rider, now close enough to reveal familiar, unmistakable details. The confident set of his shoulders, the steady, determined way he sat upon his exhausted horse, the dark hair, wind-swept and disheveled from days of hard travel. Elinor's breath caught sharply in her throat. It was Julian. He had arrived. Julian brought his exhausted horse to a sharp stop just short of the carriage, swinging down from the saddle before the animal had even fully settled. 3 days of hard travel showed clearly in his appearance, his coat dusty and creased, his face drawn with fatigue, yet his eyes, when they found Elinor standing near the edge of the lane, held an intensity that pushed aside every trace of exhaustion. "Elinor," he said, his voice rough from days of travel but unmistakably steady. "Julian," she breathed, her hand rising instinctively to cover her mouth as relief and disbelief washed over her in equal measure. "You came." "Of course I came," he said, closing the remaining distance between them with quick, purposeful strides. "Did you truly believe I would not?" Before Elinor could answer, Mr. Colton stepped forward from beside the carriage, his expression tightening with obvious displeasure at the unexpected interruption. "Your Grace," he said, offering a stiff, hurried bow. "Forgive the intrusion, but Miss Whitmore is currently under strict instructions from her father to relocate immediately. I must insist we continue with our departure without further delay." Julian turned to face the secretary directly, his exhaustion giving way to a calm, controlled authority that left little room for argument. "And who, exactly, gave those instructions?" "Her father, Mr. Edmund Whitmore," Colton replied, though his confidence had visibly weakened under the weight of Julian's steady gaze. "Then perhaps Mr. Whitmore would benefit from learning a few facts he appears to have overlooked," Julian said, reaching into his coat and retrieving Elinor's original letter, along with several additional papers he had carefully gathered during his journey. Facts regarding the true origin of the rumors that led to his daughter's unjust exile. Colton hesitated, glancing uncertainly between Julian and the papers now extended toward him. "Your Grace, I am merely following instructions. I have no authority to alter my employer's arrangements." "Then you may deliver a message directly to your employer," Julian said firmly. "Tell him that I possess clear evidence proving the rumors against his daughter originated from Colonel Grant, a man motivated entirely by wounded pride following her rightful refusal of his attentions. Tell him that I intend to make this evidence known publicly, unless Elinor is permitted to remain here, free from any further attempts to relocate or silence her, while the truth is properly addressed." A tense silence settled over the small group gathered near the carriage, broken only by the soft, restless movement of the horses. Colton's expression shifted slowly from stubborn insistence to visible uncertainty. "I was given no instructions regarding such a possibility, Your Grace." "Then I suggest you seek new instructions immediately," Julian replied evenly. "In the meantime, Miss Whitmore will remain exactly where she is." Elinor watched the exchange with a mixture of astonishment and quiet pride, hardly able to believe the calm, unshakable authority with which Julian had managed to completely reverse the course of the afternoon's events within mere minutes of his arrival. Colton, clearly recognizing the shift in circumstances, offered a reluctant, stiff nod. "I will send word to Mr. Whitmore immediately, Your Grace, though I cannot promise how he will respond to such a demand." "That is entirely his choice to make," Julian said. "But he should understand clearly that the truth will come to light regardless of his decision. The only remaining question is whether it does so with his cooperation or without it." Colton climbed back into the carriage without further argument, issuing quiet instructions to the driver before the vehicle pulled slowly away down the lane, leaving Julian and Alina standing together in the quiet stillness that followed its departure. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened settling heavily between them. "I cannot believe you rode 3 days for this," Alina finally said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion she could no longer contain. "I would have ridden considerably further if it had been required," Julian replied softly, stepping closer to her. "Alina, I meant every word in my letter. I do not intend to simply resolve this situation and then quietly disappear, leaving you once again isolated from the life you deserve." Alina searched his tired, travel-worn face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt and finding none. "And what exactly do you intend, Julian?" "I intend to see this matter through completely," he said firmly. "Colonel Grant's dishonesty will be exposed, your family will be forced to acknowledge the truth publicly, and you will be restored to the life and reputation that was so unfairly taken from you." He paused, his expression softening slightly as he reached for her hand. "And if you are willing, I intend to ask you properly, without the shadow of scandal hanging over either of us, whether you would consider becoming my wife." Alina's breath caught sharply at his words, tears rising unexpectedly to her eyes despite the overwhelming relief and joy flooding through her chest. "Julian, are you certain? After everything that has happened, the rumors, the scandal, my family's interference, are you truly certain this is what you want?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Julian said firmly, his thumb brushing gently across her hand. "You are the only person I have ever known who faced injustice with such quiet honesty and courage, rather than bitterness or despair. I do not intend to let such a woman slip away simply because society demands a smoother, less complicated story." Alina laughed softly through her tears, a sound of genuine relief and happiness that felt foreign after so many weeks of quiet sorrow. "Then yes, Julian, I would be honored to accept whenever you are ready to ask properly." Julian smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Alina had seen on his exhausted features since his arrival. "Then let us first make certain your father understands the full truth of this situation. After that, I intend to ask you again, this time with the proper words such a moment deserves." Mrs. Foley, who had been watching the entire exchange from a respectful distance near the front door, finally stepped forward, unable to fully contain her own relieved smile. "Your Grace, you must be utterly exhausted from your journey. Please, allow us to offer you proper food and rest before anything further is decided." Julian accepted gratefully, finally allowing himself a moment of relief now that the most urgent danger had been addressed. As they made their way toward the house together, Alina found herself glancing repeatedly at Julian's tired but determined face, still hardly able to believe that he had truly come all this way, driven entirely by loyalty to the truth and to her. Over a simple but welcome meal prepared quickly by Mrs. Foley, Julian explained in greater detail everything he had learned during his careful investigation back in London, including the specific evidence he had gathered proving Colonel Grant's role in spreading the damaging rumors. "He grew careless in his confidence," Julian explained, believing no one would ever question a story that so conveniently protected his wounded pride. "A few careful conversations with servants and acquaintances who owed me small favors were enough to uncover his involvement." Alina listened intently, feeling a fresh wave of anger toward Colonel Grant, though it remained tempered by relief at finally seeing a clear path toward resolving the injustice that had upended her life so completely. "What happens now?" she asked, once Julian had finished explaining the full scope of his findings. "Now," Julian said, "we return to London together, prepared to present the truth clearly and without hesitation. Your father will have no choice but to acknowledge what has happened, particularly once Colonel Grant's involvement becomes impossible to deny." Alina nodded slowly, though a flicker of uncertainty remained in her expression. "And my family, do you believe they will truly accept the truth even now?" Julian's expression softened with quiet reassurance. Whether they choose to accept it gracefully or not, the truth itself will remain unchanged. And regardless of their reaction, Alina, you no longer need to face any of this alone. Alina felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth she had not experienced since long before her sudden exile had begun. For the first time in many weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future built not on fear or careful, cautious survival, but on genuine hope and honest partnership. As evening settled over Thornfield Hollow, Julian finally allowed himself the rest his exhausted body had long demanded, while Alina remained awake a while longer, sitting quietly by her window, watching the peaceful countryside she had grown to appreciate during her time in exile. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever difficult conversations awaited them once they returned to London, Alina understood clearly that the loneliest chapter of her life had finally, truly come to an end. The return journey to London took considerably longer than Julian's original ride toward Thornfield Hollow, slowed deliberately to accommodate Alina's comfort and the practical arrangements required for her proper return to society. Julian arranged for a suitable carriage to carry Alina, Bess, and himself back toward the city, while Henry Doyle rode ahead to deliver a carefully worded message to the Dowager Duchess, informing her of the situation and requesting that she prepare for their arrival with appropriate discretion. During the journey, Alina found herself growing steadily more anxious as the familiar landmarks of London began to appear along the horizon. Despite Julian's calm reassurance, she could not fully shake the fear of how her family, and society at large, might react once the full truth became known. "You seem troubled," Julian observed gently, noticing the tension in her expression as their carriage rolled steadily closer to the city. "I keep imagining every possible way this could still go wrong," Alina admitted quietly. "My father is not a man who easily admits mistakes, particularly not in front of others." Julian reached across the carriage and took her hand firmly in his own. "Whatever your father chooses to admit or deny, the truth itself remains unaffected. And you will not be facing any of it without support, Alina. That much I promise you." Alina offered a small, grateful smile, though the knot of anxiety in her chest remained firmly in place as their carriage finally passed through the familiar, busy streets of London. Their first stop was not the Whitmore townhouse, but rather a quiet meeting arranged discreetly at the Hartwell residence, where Julian intended to lay out the full evidence of Colonel Grant's involvement before any confrontation with Alina's family took place. The Dowager Duchess greeted them both with careful, measured politeness, her earlier reservations about Julian's impulsive journey now tempered by the seriousness of the situation before her. "I have reviewed the letter you sent ahead," she said to Alina, studying her with an expression that held more sympathy than Alina had expected. "If everything Julian believes to be true is accurate, then you have endured a truly unjust situation, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you, Your Grace," Alina replied carefully. "I only hope others will be as willing to accept the truth." "We shall see to that," the Dowager Duchess said firmly, surprising Alina with the sudden resolve in her tone. "I have no patience for men like Colonel Grant, who hide behind wounded pride while allowing an innocent woman to suffer the consequences of their own poor character." With the Dowager Duchess's unexpected support secured, Julian arranged a private meeting the following afternoon, inviting both Alina's father and Colonel Grant under the careful pretense of discussing an unrelated business matter, ensuring neither man had adequate time to prepare a defense against what awaited them. Alina waited anxiously at the Hartwell residence while Julian met privately with the two men, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as the minutes stretched onward without any word of how the confrontation was unfolding. When Julian finally returned, his expression carried a mixture of quiet satisfaction and lingering frustration. "It is done," he said, settling beside her with obvious relief. "Colonel Grant attempted to deny everything at first, but the evidence I presented left him little room for continued dishonesty. Faced with the possibility of public exposure, he ultimately admitted the truth in front of your father. Elinor felt a rush of overwhelming relief wash through her chest. And my father, how did he respond? Julian's expression grew more careful. He was, understandably, quite shaken by the revelation. I believe a part of him already suspected the truth, yet chose the easier path of avoiding scandal rather than defending you properly. He has asked to see you directly, Elinor, to offer his own explanation and, I believe, his apology. Elinor's chest tightened at the thought of facing her father again after everything that had happened. Yet she understood that some conversations, however difficult, could not be avoided if she truly wished to reclaim her place within her family and within society. The following morning, Elinor returned to the Whitmore townhouse for the first time since her sudden departure weeks earlier. Her father waited for her in the same drawing room where he had once so quickly dismissed her explanations, his usually confident posture now noticeably subdued. "Elinor," he said quietly, rising as she entered the room, "I owe you a great deal more than a simple apology, though I fear it is all I currently have to offer." Elinor studied her father's face carefully, searching for genuine remorse beneath his carefully composed expression. "You believed a stranger's bitter accusation over your own daughter's word, father. An apology, while necessary, does not erase the weeks I spent isolated and alone because of that choice." "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy with quiet regret. "I allowed my fear of scandal to outweigh my trust in you, and for that I am truly sorry. I cannot undo the harm already done, but I intend to make certain the truth is properly acknowledged, publicly and without hesitation." Elinor felt the tension in her chest ease slightly at his sincere, if imperfect, acknowledgement. She did not believe a single conversation could fully repair the damage caused by her family's earlier betrayal, but it represented, at the very least, a genuine and necessary beginning. Over the following days, word of Colonel Grant's dishonesty spread quietly but steadily through London society, carefully guided by Julian's influence to ensure the truth reached the right ears without unnecessary scandal attaching itself further to Elinor's name. Colonel Grant himself, faced with the complete collapse of his reputation, quietly withdrew from society altogether, retreating to a distant property far from the judgmental eyes of London's elite. Elinor's own reputation, meanwhile, began a slow but steady process of restoration, aided considerably by the Dowager Duchess's public support and Julian's unwavering, visible loyalty throughout the entire ordeal. As the weeks passed, Elinor found herself gradually settling back into London society, though she carried with her a new sense of quiet strength and independence forged during her time at Thornfield Hollow. She visited Charlotte often, grateful to finally speak openly with her sister without the careful, guarded language their earlier letters had required. One evening, several weeks after her return to London, Julian invited Elinor to walk with him through the same gardens where they had first shared a quiet conversation many months earlier, long before the scandal had ever threatened to separate them. The evening air carried a gentle warmth, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows across the carefully tended paths as they walked together in comfortable silence. "Do you remember this place?" Julian asked, stopping beside a small stone bench nestled among the flowering hedges. "Of course I remember," Elinor replied softly, smiling at the memory. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Julian turned to face her fully, his expression growing quietly serious despite the warmth still lingering in his eyes. "I promised you I would ask properly, once the shadow hanging over us had finally been lifted." Elinor's breath caught as she watched him lower himself onto one knee before her, his hand reaching for hers with steady, unwavering confidence. "Elinor Whitmore," he said, "you faced injustice with more courage and honesty than most people could ever hope to summon under far easier circumstances. I do not simply admire you for surviving what happened. I admire you for remaining true to yourself throughout every difficult moment of it. I would be deeply honored if you would agree to become my wife." Tears rose freely to Elinor's eyes as she looked down at him, her heart overflowing with a happiness she had once feared she would never fully experience again. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with joy. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. Julian rose quickly, drawing her into a warm, gentle embrace as the golden light of sunset settled softly around them, marking the beginning of a future neither scandal nor fear would ever again be permitted to threaten. Their wedding took place several months later, a quiet but joyful celebration attended by close family and friends who had remained loyal throughout the difficult months of Alina's exile. Even her father, humbled by the experience, stood proudly among the guests, having spent the intervening months working carefully to rebuild the trust his earlier actions had so deeply damaged. Alina stood beside Julian that day, dressed in soft ivory silk, feeling for the first time in a long while completely and confidently herself, free from the fear and isolation that had once threatened to define her entire future. As they exchanged their vows beneath a canopy of soft summer light, Alina allowed herself a final, quiet reflection on everything she had endured, the painful exile, the quiet strength she had discovered within herself, and the unwavering loyalty of the man now standing beside her, who had ridden 3 days without rest simply because he refused to let a lie stand unchallenged. Whatever difficulties life might still bring their way, Alina understood clearly that she would never again face them entirely alone. A year after their wedding, Alina and Julian returned to Thornfield Hollow, not as a place of exile this time, but as honored guests eager to revisit the quiet countryside that had once offered Alina shelter during her most difficult days. Mrs. Foley greeted them at the door with open delight, clearly overjoyed to see the young woman she had once comforted through weeks of uncertainty, now returning as the Duchess of Ravenswood, radiant and settled beside her husband. "You have brought some color back into this old house, Your Grace," Mrs. Foley said warmly, ushering them inside with obvious pride. "It has felt rather quiet without you." Alina laughed softly, embracing the older woman with genuine affection. "This house gave me far more than shelter, Mrs. Foley. I do not think I could ever properly repay what it offered me during those difficult months." They spent several days at the estate, walking the familiar fields and lanes that had once provided Alina with quiet comfort during her loneliest hours. She visited Tom and Alice as well, delighted to find the young girl now taller, more confident, and eager to show off the small garden she had begun tending on her own. "Papa says I have a talent for growing things," Alice announced proudly, guiding Alina through neat rows of vegetables and flowers arranged with surprising care for someone so young. "I believe he is entirely correct," Alina said, admiring the girl's careful work. "You have grown a great deal since I last saw you, Alice." "So have you," Alice replied simply, studying Alina with the same direct honesty she had shown during their very first meeting. "You seem happier now." Alina smiled, resting a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "I am, Alice, far happier than I ever imagined I would be, especially after everything that happened before I came here." As evening settled over the estate, Julian and Alina sat together on the same small bench near the garden where she had once written the very first hesitant lines of the letter that had ultimately changed the course of both their lives. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Alina asked quietly, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the distant hills. "Often," Julian admitted, taking her hand gently in his own. "If Henry's cousin had not happened to work at that particular coaching inn, if your letter had simply disappeared among countless others, I might never have learned the truth in time." Alina considered this thought carefully, a small shiver passing through her despite the warm evening air. "It frightens me sometimes, how easily things might have remained hidden forever." "Perhaps," Julian said softly, "but they did not remain hidden. You found the courage to write the truth, even without any expectation of reward, and that courage is ultimately what changed everything." Alina leaned her head gently against his shoulder, watching the golden light fade slowly across the quiet countryside. "I suppose some truths simply refuse to stay buried forever, no matter how carefully others try to hide them." Their visit to Thornfield Hollow also brought a quiet, welcome reunion with Charlotte, who had traveled separately to join them for the final days of their stay. The sisters spent long hours walking together through the same fields Alina had once wandered alone, finally able to speak freely without the careful caution that had once shaped every word passed between them. "I always believed you," Charlotte confided one afternoon, as they sat together near the edge of a quiet stream running along the property's border. "Even when Mother and Father refused to listen, I never once doubted you." "I know," Alina said gently, squeezing her sister's hand. "Your letters, careful as they had to be, meant more to me during that time than you will ever fully understand." Charlotte smiled, though a hint of lingering guilt remained visible in her expression. "I only wish I could have done more to help you sooner." "You did exactly what you could, given the circumstances," Alina reassured her firmly. "And in the end, that was enough to help bring the truth to light." Their father, too, had made continued efforts throughout the year to repair the trust his earlier actions had damaged so severely. He visited Alina and Julian regularly, careful never to overstep the boundaries Alina had firmly established following her return to society, yet consistently demonstrating through small, genuine gestures that his regret ran far deeper than a single hurried apology. During one such visit, shortly before Alina and Julian's return to Thornfield Hollow, her father had quietly confessed something Alina had not previously known. "I want you to understand," he had said carefully, "that even in the earliest days after your departure, a part of me suspected we had made a terrible mistake. I simply lacked the courage to admit it, fearing what such an admission might cost our family's standing." "And now?" Alina had asked. "Now," he replied, "I understand that protecting our family's reputation should never have come at the cost of protecting you. It is a lesson I deeply regret needing to learn in such a painful way." Alina had accepted his words carefully, understanding that trust, once broken so severely, could not be fully restored through words alone. Yet she recognized, too, the genuine effort behind his continued attempts to make amends, and she allowed herself, slowly and cautiously, to rebuild at least a portion of the relationship they had once shared. As their visit to Thornfield Hollow drew to a close, Alina found herself standing once more at the old writing desk in the small study, the same desk where she had once agonized for weeks before finally finding the courage to write her letter to Julian. She ran her fingers gently across the smooth, familiar wood, reflecting quietly on everything that single letter had ultimately set into motion. "Regretting anything?" Julian asked softly, stepping into the room behind her. "Not at all," Alina replied, turning to face him with a warm, contented smile. "I was simply remembering how frightened I felt, sitting here trying to find the right words. I never could have imagined at the time where those words would eventually lead." Julian crossed the room and wrapped his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin softly against the top of her head. "I am endlessly grateful you found the courage to write them, regardless of how frightened you felt in that moment." Alina turned within his embrace, looking up at him with quiet affection. "As am I, Julian, more grateful than words could ever properly express." Together they left the small study, closing the door quietly behind them, leaving the old writing desk resting peacefully in the fading afternoon light, its work long since finished, its quiet role in their story complete. As their carriage finally pulled away from Thornfield Hollow, carrying them back toward the busy streets and familiar comforts of London, Alina looked back one final time at the gray stone house nestled quietly among the golden fields, a place that had once represented isolation and fear, now forever remembered instead as the quiet, unlikely beginning of her greatest happiness. Whatever challenges life might still bring their way in the years ahead, Alina understood, with quiet and unshakable certainty, that she and Julian would continue to face them exactly as they had faced this one, together honestly, and without fear of whatever truth still remained to be discovered.